Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Nimble Nonprofit webinar series, Staying Strategic in Changing Times. I'm Steve Zimmerman, the principal here at Spectrum Nonprofit Services. It's great to see so many of you with us here today and also to see so many familiar names. Thank you for joining us. It really does mean a lot. We've been through a lot over the last several years. I don't need to tell you that. And yet through it all, nonprofits continue to move forward, delivering on their mission and strengthening our communities. It has not, however, been easy. Again, something you know all too well. The words of strategic planning often bring thoughts of exhaustion for most nonprofit leaders. See, many of us think of strategy as a linear process, as if our only problem being a nonprofit leader was that we didn't have it written down. If we learned nothing from the pandemic, however, it's that prescriptive, detailed plans don't reflect the reality in which we operate in. Every day, our organizations are buffeted by external and internal forces, causing us to shift to continue to deliver on our mission. For us here, the strategic thinking and strategic doing actually reflects reality. Leaders bring people together to make real-time strategic decisions to build high-impact, equitable, financially viable, and sustainable organizations. Now, I would like to tell you that we're going to end all this uncertainty. We might hope that the pandemic is behind us, but there does continue to be increased uncertainty in our sector. The latest Nonprofit Finance Fund State of the Sector report showed that, that there is going to be, and not only has there been actually an increase in demand for services, but that increase is going to continue. And organizations have not been able to meet all of the demand for their services, even in its current state. When we think about funding, right, the headlines show that donations are up, but the number of households donating has declined over the last 20 years. And the uber wealthy are tending to donate to foundations and donor advised funds, which don't necessarily translate to money going into the operating nonprofits. If you put these statistics together with inflation and workforce shortages, well, the only certainty is more uncertainty. Enough bad news for a minute. Where do we actually look for inspiration? Usually you're used to, in our discussions, kind of us looking at what's out there and really being able to present to you content. Well, today we wanted to have a discussion from those working tirelessly in the field. And I have the pleasure of being joined by three amazing CEOs who have really led their organizations during this pandemic, as so many of you have, continuing to be strategic, continuing to deliver on their mission in new and exciting ways. Her-Xiong is the founder and CEO of the Hmong American Peace Academy, a high-performing, award-winning K-4 through 12 charter school with over 1,800 students. During COVID, HAPA, as the school is called, continued to expand and opened up a brand new state-of-the-art high school facility. Clarence is the president and CEO of Wisconsin Community Services, which focuses on individuals in underserved communities who face adversity with behavioral health needs and/or involvement in the criminal justice system. During the pandemic, and through this all, Clarence restructured the organization's leadership team and embarked on a strategy process that included engaging a broader collection of staff in determining priorities. And Angie Moellering is the president and CEO of Lutheran Social Services of Indiana, which promotes the overall health of their community by equipping willing families facing the most challenging obstacles with the skills necessary to make positive life choices and advance towards economic and family stability. During COVID, they expanded their employment program, also continuing in their strategic direction and opening a new facility. Thank you all for joining me here today for this conversation and for sharing your expertise with this group. Angie, I'm going to go ahead and start with you. when you think about strategy for your organization, how do you think about that? What does that mean to you?
Well, strategy really is, and you've already touched on this, is really a process that involves everyone in our organization. It especially involves our board and then also those key leaders of different departments. But then strategy becomes a foundation. So I think strategy kind of helps you set your vision for the future, where you're headed. And it's this foundation that undergirds you, but it allows flexibility throughout. I've seen some strategy documents that really tie people down. And I think that you need strategy that's fluid enough to deal with our changing times and with what's coming at us. Something that can be managed so that as those changes come, you can stay pretty current and pretty adaptive.
Okay, thank you. Clarence, what about for you in Wisconsin Community Services? How do you approach strategy, and has that changed at all during the pandemic?
Well, it certainly has changed from the pandemic in terms of the kinds of things that we had to focus on. For WCS, or Wisconsin Community Services, strategy is a process that allows key stakeholders to align around key strategies, key approaches, or key plans in terms of where you're headed into the future. So for us, strategy, I'd like to think, Steve, really sort of starts at a high level. I think drilling down too deeply can become problematic, quite frankly, and encumbering. But if you have strategy that's identified and sits at high level, or perhaps a little bit deeper, then it allows your staff and your board, your stakeholders or community to rally around sort of key points or key things, in this case, key strategies, that we can have conversations around, that we can agree, help to set the priorities for the organization, help to determine ways in which the organization's resources, time, energy will be invested. So for that reason, it's important because it creates this space that people can rally around and have conversation around and remain aligned with where the organization is going.
Okay, thank you. And Ms. Her-Xiong, I'm opening up a new school facility in the midst of COVID, and and education being so hit with it. Clearly strategy and thinking about strategy in an ongoing way is something that seems to be in the DNA for HAPA. I'm curious as to how you think about it, and perhaps how you've engaged your board in that process.
Thank you, Steve. For me, strategy is all about mission focus. You could have 100 strategies, but you have to be mission focused, and the mission drives the strategies from the boardroom to the classroom. Without the focus on the mission, strategy is going to not hit the target. And so the strategy is to make sure that we're all aligned with our mission and vision and where we're moving forward. Despite the COVID, despite all of the challenges, we continue to keep our eyes on the prize. And that's a strategy that we've always used to keep us going for the last 18 years.
So you each talked about, trying to use your words, Ms. Her-Xiong, kind of keeping your eye on the prize and that big picture. I'm curious, when you think about, when you think about strategy and you think about kind of defining what that prize is, or defining that mission, I believe you said, Clarence, and talking about that, is strategy something that is always a topic of discussion at staff and board meetings? And how does that perhaps differ from a strategic planning process as you think about those insurmountable words and going in that direction? And I'll throw it over to you, Clarence, if you have thoughts on that.
Well, my thoughts would be such that strategy, it doesn't necessarily permeate every meeting or conversation, but it's something that we all know is there. And it becomes a sort of fabric, if you will, through which, again, conversations occur, which decisions are made. And for us, we found that's been much more helpful than drilling down and getting involved. And not that those things are bad, but developing very lengthy, detailed strategic plans that to some degree become, quite frankly, those documents can become so time consuming that they become the means to an end. And so you end up spending an inordinate amount of time trying to execute those things. And oftentimes you sort of lose track why, versus higher level strategy that, again, guide, give you direction for the organization, but allow you to evaluate risk, opportunities, and the work that you're doing in a different way, in a much more agile way, quite frankly. So these are things that we've certainly learned over the last couple of years. The world, as you mentioned, Steve, is changing so quickly. COVID has accelerated that. And if we were too tethered in very deep, highly structured strategic plans, then I don't believe we would have been as capable of making, what was really a significant shift to help manage through the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah. Angie, when I think about that and I listen to that response, one of the pushbacks that we often will get is that it's easy then to get distracted by what's happening around you. So I'm curious, kind of, you spoke earlier about that big picture plan and kind of strategic direction. How do you ensure and think about it as an ongoing tool to make sure that you're actually being strategic as you move forward?
Well, some days are easier than others. I'm not going to say that I never get distracted or our teams don't get distracted. So, I think what has helped us is to do that strategic planning work. So having those conversations, you almost have to mark a time, okay, for this period of time, we are going to focus on what our ongoing strategy is and get something on paper. And so that was really helpful to us in 2019. We did not know a pandemic was coming, but we had something on paper. And so then we of course, we got distracted by the pandemic, and our strategies had to change and we had to adapt very quickly. However, we had something to go back to. And so making sure that that was out there and it was kind of woven in. I think, so if leaders are tired, it's because I think a lot of our work is to keep bringing things back up to strategy. So I'm in discussions with program leaders, and we want them to catch that strategy and to understand that strategy, but to keep bringing them back to strategy as they look at, okay, what's next? Or do we take this on? Or do we adapt this service? And I think it's the same way at the board level. We keep bringing board back to strategy discussions. Not that some board members don't stay focused on strategy, but it's easy for them sometimes to get in the weeds or to get distracted. So I think that's our job as leaders, to kind of keep bringing it back, even though we weave it in to our discussions and to our training with leadership and our work with leadership, but to keep bringing it back to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And Ms. Her-Xiong, how would you say, that your approach to strategy, prepared you for the changes in COVID? And, as you think about kind of where we go here and continued uncertainty, what changes are you doing to your how you approach strategy? What does that look like for you?
Thank you. We were at the end of our 5-year strategic plan and COVID came. And so we had to quickly shift and look at priorities, look at strategies that will move us from point A to point B. And we were we did an assessment, reflection. We looked at our past, our present, and our potential. And we had to really reevaluate our customers. Who are our customers? And prior to COVID-19, the customers have always been the parents. But then I had to readjust and focus that the customers are our teachers, our staff. We have to address our customers, who are our teachers, so that they could address the other customers. And so then we had to really come up with a strategic plan, but focus on the mission, and that is to make sure that we're addressing the missions, but that we set a mindset of thrive instead of survival. And then again, re-evaluating our customers and really addressing that need so that we can move forward with the urgency, but also with being strategic and how we address these crises. I call it a mini crisis because the pandemic is a crisis for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Clarence, I'm curious kind of at WCS as you think about this. I also know that you went through a period where you really took a focus on being a people-centered organization and really trying to understand the needs of the people you serve. If you can talk a little bit about, in the midst of a pandemic, also making that shift, how do you manage those, I don't want to say competing, but all the different priorities that you had as you were enacting strategy?
Well, in many ways, the example that you raised, Steve, is really a good one, because I think what the pandemic compelled us to do was to connect with those that we served in a different way. So it's probably a place we would have eventually grown to. However, the pandemic really, I think, forced all those things to accelerate from the standpoint that we needed to find ways to connect with those that we were serving and to communicate in a very clear way that their safety, their well-being was a top priority for us, and along with that of our staff. So from that standpoint, that strategy really aligned itself very well. And what I found that occurred during the pandemic is that there was the first probably 3-4 months where we were all sort of in shock. I know I was. But at some point you realize, well, this isn't going to go away, and we can't come in every day and look like we're afraid or that we're not confident. And so it allowed us to really do things not only in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, but also really sharpen our strategy in terms of how we could do a better job connecting with those that we serve, and to communicate very clearly that, as you mentioned, we are a very person-centered organization.
Mm-hmm. So, each of you have talked a little bit about, listening to multiple people, bringing lots of people into the process. Angie, you spoke about the tension between being in the program day to day and the big picture strategy, and kind of this idea of having a strategic direction as opposed to a detailed prescriptive plan that has really helped you. I'm wondering if each of you could talk just a little bit about what, so specifically when you think about strategy and a strategy process for your organization, what would you say are the key elements or things that really help you deliver on that, right? Is there something that happens because you each have a strategy process still, but is there something that happens in that process that has really helped you be able to be nimble during these times that you would hope to maybe expand as you move forward? Angie, I'll start with you if you want.
One of the things that we started, and I believe we really had this going before COVID, but we were spending time, an executive staff, with our program directors. And it actually ends up being quite a bit of time. We have monthly meetings with them individually, and they were really focused on outcomes and our balanced scorecard before COVID. They kind of morphed into more strategy meetings. And that is because there's so much happening at the program level, and as Clarence talked about, and also Chris talked about, at the level where the clients are. So we have to be hearing what they're struggling with and what's going on there, but then also keeping focused on that strategy lens and being very willing to say, okay, this strategy is not working. And I think with those conversations with program leaders, we're a little closer to it and we can see a little sooner what's not working. And then we can also tie in So we have people in our organization that are very focused on programs and on services, very important. We're a human service organization, but then bringing that business lens. And so these conversations have really allowed us to help those that are really running our departments to merge those together. And some organizations may hire people coming in that are right there, but I think most of us hire people that have a passion for this work, and then we have to bring them into it. So I think that that's something we've learned, is because we keep saying, can we back away from these meetings? We have so many other things to do, but what we've seen is that's really where the strategy comes together and is implemented. And although we would like to be able to present it and have them go implement it, us staying very connected to them has been important.
Mm-hmm. Great point. Thank you. Chris, I'll kind of ask you the same question.
I think one of the investment that the board did for me as a leader is to hire an external coach to help me think it through. And the picture is that with COVID-19, we're all riding in the lake of this massive lake, and some organizations are huge vessels, and some are small ships, and we have to all need to know how to move that boat around so that we don't get sinked in. And so one of the things that the board did for me was to hire independent coach to help me think it out, think it through. It's a lonely place on the top. And so just having someone to help me bounce off ideas, and that has helped me to manage trust within the organization. Because with COVID-19, we were all afraid of the unknown, and managing that trust was essential in moving from good to great. And I think that and it's okay to ask for help. It's okay for leaders to ask for help and say, look, I need someone to help me think it through. And so I think that being humble at the same time, asking for guidance and help, has really allowed our organization to thrive under these conditions.
Thank you very much. And yeah, absolutely important pieces. It's hard to be vulnerable and ask for help, but remembering that we're all committed to the mission, and how do we get there is really needs to be paramount. Clarence, kind of same question for you as you think about, strategy, and was there an element of the process or something that you want to grow as you take forward to continue this kind of this approach?
Well, first of all, I would say amen to Chris's comment about asking for help. But Steve, I'm very quick to ask for help and support. No one person can do it alone, and certainly one person in a leadership role is not going to be effective unless there are others supporting and assisting along the way. I would say, it's a really good question. Before the onset of the pandemic, one of the strategic directions that we had was to be the provider of choice. And we never quite understood sort of what that meant in terms of executing it beyond, we sort of had this vision. And what we learned over the past several years, and I think this too was accelerated with the pandemic, is that it's really important for us to be agile and be responsive. And, Steve, as you're aware, we've had tremendous growth over the past 3 years, which is amazing when you think about the fact that we did much of this during the middle of a pandemic. And I think being able to seeing things through a lens of agility, being flexible, and not being too tethered to things that we believe that were sort of sacred, that we could not change. And Wisconsin Community Services had a pretty unique identity for many years, and still does, but it was somewhat, I would say, constricted. And I think what we discovered over the past 3-4 years, and with adding some really key leaders, is that we could really go outside of that, what I would call a very prescribed box, and see ourselves differently in terms of how we meet community needs along the 2 lines that you mentioned earlier. So being able to see things from an agile perspective, and also I think involving really key leaders who are thoughtful and innovative and passionate has been very helpful. And I think, quite frankly, me letting go as well. And as a leader, seeing things differently and not always having a sense that I have to control things or make the final decisions, but allow others to lead. And in many ways, my leadership, I sort of lead from behind. Let others shine. And I think that's helped us tremendously in terms of how we execute on strategy, and also, how we continue to be relevant and vibrant and strong.
Inspiring. Thank you, Clarence. I really appreciate that. I do want to invite people, if you want to put in your own questions, you can use the Q&A app or bar down there at the bottom in the toolbar for Zoom. Please do feel free to do so. All of you hit on the fact that strategy takes courage. And, it's interesting because you think about the fact that people still in today's day and age have this idea of the superhero leader, and that actually the CEO's role in most nonprofits is not the superhero leader. If anything, it's a superhero facilitator. How do you bring people along so that you can collectively set the direction for this community-based organization? I'm curious, as we've heard a little bit about how you found the courage. Chris, you talked about a coach and kind of really doing the coaching. I'm curious, kind of, as you think about that role of a courageous leader, what would you tell other leaders that may be feeling uncertain at this time?
I could start.
Sure.
The phrase that I've developed during the COVID-19 is carry less, care more. Carry less, care more is that I don't have to know all the answers. I don't have to do everything, but I just need to care about the people that are my frontline soldiers, that are mission driven, that are leading the organization. And so I think that that's a phrase that I develop and adapted to during the COVID. And I'm finding that the courage to hire someone who is more talented than you to lead the organization, and that you are just the cheerleader. That has helped me to stay afresh, but stay committed to the mission and not burn myself through the pandemic or with the pandemic or with just burnt out. And so there's so much challenges, and I just didn't want to put myself in the burnt out rate. And so I came with the acceptance that it's okay to say you don't know, and it's okay to accept help, and it's okay to care more and carry less.
Thank you. Angie, you want to?
Sure. I think that sometimes we think courage is the absence of uncertainty, but it's not. I mean, when we look at history and you call people courageous, it's kind of when the fire was nipping at their heels, right? I mean, that's what courage is. So I think for those of us in human services and education, I mean, we're needed more than ever. And so it's not really a time to back off or to step away. It's a time to lean in. And I think both Chris and Clarence have hit on it, is how do you bring up those leaders around you? And the other thing is, I use this term a lot with my board, with fellow CEOs, and with you, Steve, I've mentioned this too, is thought partners. Finding people who we can talk with that will challenge us. And say, are you asking the right questions, or have you thought about X or Y? And it's so helpful to have those thought partners. And again, it is saying, I can't do this alone. I need those around me who can help me do it, but also kind of digging in our heels. I think part of what makes a good leader is this stubborn tenacity. And so, I don't know what this looks like in the end. And I guess I'm just stubborn and tenacious enough to say, well, I'm going to see this thing through. And I think that's probably true for all of us to some degree.
Which for me, Angela, translate to, I'm afraid to fail. So you sort of keep going, right? Well, and I like a lot of what both Angela and Chris have said. And for me, it's sort of like, I would say, think of yourselves as climbing Mount Everest, right? I mean, whoever thought that before, who was it that climbed out the first, Sir Edmund Hillary, that it could be done. And so I think back to writing proposals over the past couple of decades, and there's always a question in there which says, what is your pandemic response plan? And I would go, what the heck do I need that for? That's never going to happen, right? Well, guess what? I needed the plan, and when I went to retrieve it, I had virtually nothing. Maybe it was a page and a half. So we had to learn quickly. We had to respond quickly. And what I would say to those who are feeling still uncertain, as many of us are, quite frankly, I would say to yourselves, you survived. And in many cases, you've thrived over the past 2.5 years. Think of the accelerated growth, learning, knowledge that's happened. Things that would have probably taken another 10 years have sort of happened over the past 2.5 years or so. They had to, because we needed to really find a way to manage through this crisis. And that's pretty damn amazing. And so all these staff, all of your staff, all of your consumers, those that you serve, your stakeholders, your funders, they've all sort of been in that journey with you. And that's created, in my estimation, a really great rallying point. Now, when we see each other, we're talking, yeah, how are you doing? How are things going through the pandemic? And all kinds of new programs and ideas. And those things are, for me, exciting. And I would hope that we've seen the worst part of the pandemic. And so while we'll still have to continue to manage through it, there's light at the end of the tunnel, and being able to take all those lessons learned and move those forward, I think is a pretty amazing opportunity, is what I would say.
Thank you. So we had a question that came in from one of our attendees that asked, was there a broad strategy that you found to be most useful for flexibility? So when you think about kind of your ability to be flexible and how you nimble and you know, as you said, you changed everything. What broad strategy really helped you there? And I think part of that is the tension between specifics and that high level. And so I'm just curious as to how you find that right, that right note and what helped you with that.
I'll start.
Sure.
What I would say is probably just having a little bit of trust in the process. You need to have, at least in our case, we needed to have some parameters, some boundaries, some ground rules, if you will, in terms of how we were going to operate. But I believe just that being open to and having conversations. So coming into a space for a meeting, and oftentimes I'd go into that space and I would already have a solution or an answer. This is it. We're doing X and Y. And so for me, one of the most difficult things was to come in there and set that aside and listen to other points of view, which may have been, quite frankly, contrary to my own. So being able to listen and being able to change my own thoughts and perspective on whether it's some sort of a tactic or some sort of priority or how we actualize it. I think that's important for me personally, but also for the group of leaders that are working together, having that ability to truly listen and not listen, but oftentimes when we're listening, you already have the answer. I'm listening, but I've got a rebuttal that's going on. So not really listening, but putting all that stuff aside and just having those conversations, I think is really helpful to getting people to think differently.
Thank you.
And I could join in to Clarence point, having the courageous opportunity to say you don't know it all and to listen has really been a game changer of buy-in from the stakeholders, particularly the teachers that are struggling with the virtual teaching or the hybrid teaching. And so listening to them and hearing their voices really made a 360 degrees turnaround for me. Is that when you really have the courage to listen, you can make a difference.
Thank you.
I think for me, it's that strategy of knowing what are those things you have to be tethered to. So you kind of sort out your flexibility. So we can be flexible in these areas, but these we can't. And some of that had to do with what was keeping us sustainable, either financially or just from a staffing perspective. So I think the way you kind of sort out what you can be flexible on and how you can be flexible is saying what are the must-haves, and then kind of developing those flexible processes in that. And I think through all of this, we've had to stay a little more in real time. So strategy is looking out ahead. So we kind of had to have this balance of looking out ahead, but also staying very much in real time because things were changing so quickly and even continue to change quickly with the workforce and, you know, inflation, some of those kinds of things. So it's kind of a both and. It's staying focused on strategy, but really also staying very current in what we're looking at.
And if I could add to that, knowing your non-negotiables when it comes to health and safety. If you could set up 2 or 3 non-negotiables in terms of health and safety, then you could go work around the rest and being flexible and hearing voices. But again, as leaders, we're still accountable for the health and safety in the operations of the organization that we're hired to do. And so I think that for me, having 3 non-negotiables when it relates to health and safety.
Mm-hmm. Great.
And I think if I can just say a little bit on that is keeping those out in front of the decision makers in your organization. Here, so here's our non-negotiables. We can be flexible in these things, but this is the heart of who we are and where we're headed and what we need to be doing.
Well, thank you all very much. You know, for me, when you think about it, when I listen to you talk about the guardrails, like how you are grounded, you know, listening to how do you craft strategies. You know, we talk so much about the organizational model and that piece around, you know, understanding what the impact is, what your revenue strategy, your financial strategy is, and the people who's engaged, what are the needs of the people that you serve, really thinking about what skills and, you know, do you need on the team? And in this day and age, how do you make sure that, you know, you're have staff actually also to be able to serve them, that really having a grounding in that model and a shared agreement allows for you then to be flexible as you move forward, because you're ultimately all trying to achieve that same impact. Carry less, care more. Courage is not the absence of uncertainty. Failure is not an option. We care too much about our missions, and also, you know, look back at our track record. You survived and thrived during COVID. Well, each of you did, and I know you didn't do it alone. You did it with a lot of stakeholders and a lot of your team, but we're really grateful for the work that you do in your communities and in our communities every single day, and for leading those teams and listening and being able to bring people along as you help strengthen our community. So thank you all for joining us today and for sharing your perspectives. I will say that you know, we are grateful for their time. Spectrum Nonprofit Services is making a contribution to each of the organizations for their expertise, and it really is thankful for them sharing it with us and value the wisdom that they can provide. Now, for our part, we will be doing these 2 more kind of bite-size webinars for people, more content, you know, aspect of really thinking about impact. We talked about impact at the top of that organizational model. What does that mean? How do you uncover it? How do you get specific? So you can look for an email invitation to that one, looking like that will be in November. And then our consultant Maggie Corey is going to talk a little bit about revenue strategy. How do we think about our, once you have that impact, how do you fund that? And how do you find a sustainable future? You can look for emails coming up on that, and we'll also be in a follow-up email that will have the recording from today's session. So once again, thank you very much to our three panelists, Angie Moellering of Lutheran Social Services of Indiana, Clarence Johnson of Wisconsin Community Services, and Chris Her-Xiong of the Hmong American Peace Academy. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your leadership with your organizations. And thanks to all of you for being part of today's webinar as we think about nimble nonprofits. Our communities need strong nonprofits, perhaps more than ever before. And we're grateful for your work as we continue to try and build stronger and better communities. Have a great day, everybody.